I've always believed that family was simple. You love them, you support them, and they're always there for you. No questions asked. That's how I felt about my Uncle Daniel. From the time I was little, he was a steady presence in my life. A rock when everything else felt chaotic. My parents' messy arguments, their eventual divorce, the countless times I felt alone. Daniel was always there, filling in the gaps, making sure I never felt completely abandoned. But life has a way of taking the things you think are simple and turning them into something messy, something complicated, something dangerous. It all started at my cousin's wedding, a big, lavish affair held at a country club just outside the city. I was there as a guest, but also as a pseudo-coordinator since the bride, my cousin Ava, was frazzled beyond belief. My Uncle Daniel was there too, of course, looking sharp in a tailored navy suit. He always carried himself with this quiet confidence that made people listen when he spoke. He had a way of making you feel safe, like no matter what was happening, he'd handle it. The day was perfect, at least on the surface, but weddings have a way of bringing out the best and the worst in people. And somewhere between the cocktail hour and the first dance, things took a turn. It was during the reception when I first noticed him. A man, older than me, by at least 15 years, dressed in a suit that was just a little too flashy for the occasion. He approached me with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes and started making small talk. Where I was from, what I did for work, whether I was single. At first I thought he was just being friendly, but as the conversation went on, his questions became more personal, more intrusive. "Come on," he said, leaning in closer than I was comfortable with. "You don't really want to spend the whole night babysitting your cousin's big day, do you? Let me buy you a drink, get you away from all this noise." I forced a polite smile, taking a step back. "I'm fine, really. Thanks, though." But he didn't take the hint. Instead, he grabbed my arm, not hard, but firm enough to make my stomach twist. "Don't be like that," he said, his tone shifting to something colder. "I'm just trying to be nice." Before I could figure out what to do, a familiar voice cut through the tension. "Is there a problem here?" Daniel asked, his tone calm but carrying an unmistakable edge. The man let go of my arm and turned to face Daniel, his expression shifting from annoyance to discomfort in an instant. "No problem," he said, raising his hands as if to surrender. "We were just talking." "Well, she doesn't look like she wants to talk," Daniel said, stepping between us. He didn't yell or make a scene. He didn't have to. His presence alone was enough to make the man mutter something under his breath and disappear into the crowd. When he was gone, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. "Thank you," I said, my voice shaky. I didn't know how to get rid of him. Daniel turned to me, his expression softening. "You don't have to thank me, Claire. I'm just glad I was here." He hesitated, then added, "Are you okay?" I nodded, though my heart was still racing. "Yeah, I think so." "Good," he said. "Let's get you a drink, something to take the edge off." We ended up in a quiet corner of the bar area, away from the noise and the dancing. Daniel handed me a glass of wine, and we sat together on one of the leather couches. For a while, we just talked about Ava's wedding, my job, his latest work project. It felt normal, easy, the way it always did with him. But there was something else, too. Something I couldn't quite put my finger on. I found myself watching him more closely than usual. The way his hands moved as he spoke, the way his eyes crinkled slightly when he smiled. He'd always been handsome. I wasn't blind to that. But tonight, there was something different. Or maybe it was me who was different. At one point, he caught me staring. "What?" he asked, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Nothing," I said quickly, looking away. Thank you again. For earlier. I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't stepped in." "You don't have to thank me, Claire," he said, his voice soft. "You're family. I'll always look out for you. Family." The word should have grounded me, reminded me of the boundaries that existed between us. But instead, it made my chest tighten, like I was trying to hold on to something slipping through my fingers. The rest of the night passed in a blur. We rejoined the reception, mingled with the other guests, and eventually said our goodbyes. But even as I drove home, the events of the evening played on a loop in my mind. The man who wouldn't take no for an answer. Daniel stepping in, his hand on my arm as he led me away. The way he looked at me when we sat in the bar, his eyes steady and searching. It wasn't until I was lying in bed that I let myself acknowledge the truth. I didn't just feel safe with Daniel. I felt something else. Something deeper. Something I couldn't name. And for the first time, I wasn't sure if I wanted to. This was just the beginning. The morning after Ava's wedding felt like waking up from a dream. The sunlight streaming through the curtains seemed too bright, too sharp, as though the world was determined to remind me of its reality. But no amount of light could chase away the memory of Daniel's voice, calm and steady, or the warmth of his hand brushing against mine as he led me away from that man. It played on a loop in my mind, unrelenting. I spent the morning trying to convince myself that it was nothing. Of course I felt safe with Daniel. He had always been my protector, the person who stepped in when life felt too heavy. But this felt different. It was like a current had shifted between us, subtle but undeniable. And no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't ignore it. When my phone buzzed with a message later that day, my stomach twisted. It was Daniel. Just wanted to check in. You okay after last night? It was a simple message, the kind anyone might send. But it made my heart race. I stared at the screen for what felt like forever before typing back. I'm fine. Thanks again for stepping in. His reply came almost instantly. You don't owe me anything. But if you want to repay me, let me take you to lunch sometime. Lunch. It was harmless, normal, something we'd done dozens of times before. But this time, it felt different. I hesitated, my fingers hovering over the keyboard, before finally replying. Sure. Just let me know when. We met a few days later at a small cafe tucked away on a quiet street. It was the kind of place Daniel loved. Charming, unassuming, with mismatched furniture and the smell of fresh coffee wafting through the air. He was already there when I arrived, sitting at a corner table with 2 cups of coffee in front of him. You beat me here, I said as I slid into the seat across from him. I wanted to make sure I got your order right, he said with a small smile, pushing one of the cups toward me. Black, no sugar, right? I nodded, feeling a warmth spread through me that had nothing to do with the coffee. You have a good memory. I pay attention, he replied, his gaze steady. The conversation flowed easily, as it always did with Daniel. We talked about the wedding, about work, about anything and everything that didn't involve the unspoken shift between us. But every now and then, there was a pause, a lingering glance that made my heart pound. At one point, he reached across the table, brushing a crumb off my sleeve. It was such a small gesture, but it sent a jolt through me. His hand lingered for just a moment too long before he pulled it back, and I wondered if he felt it too. The invisible thread pulling us closer, even when we tried to resist. After lunch, we walked back to our cars, the conversation turning quieter as the reality of parting ways loomed. When we reached my car, I turned to him, suddenly unsure of what to say. Thanks for lunch, I said finally, my voice softer than I intended. Anytime, he replied, his smile easy but his eyes serious. There was a pause, a moment that stretched out longer than it should have. I opened my mouth to say something, anything to break the tension, but before I could, Daniel reached out, tucking a strand of hair behind my ear. You're amazing, you know that, he said, his voice low. My breath caught, and for a moment, the world seemed to tilt. I wanted to say something, to brush it off or laugh, or do anything that would make this moment feel less monumental. But I couldn't. All I could do was look at him, my heart pounding in my chest. I should go, I said finally, my voice barely more than a whisper. He nodded, stepping back, but his eyes never left mine. Drive safe, Claire. He got into my car and drove away, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly, my knuckles turned white. But no matter how far I drove, I couldn't escape the feeling that something between us had changed. And I didn't know if we could ever go back. That night, as I lay in bed, I replayed the day in my mind. The way his voice softened when he spoke to me. The way his hand lingered just a moment too long. The way he looked at me like I was the only person in the world. It wasn't just in my head. It couldn't be. For the first time, I let myself admit the truth. I didn't just feel safe with Daniel. I didn't just admire him or appreciate him or look up to him. I felt something deeper, something I couldn't name but knew was real. And the scariest part? I didn't want it to stop. The days that followed were a blur of confusion and longing. I tried to distract myself with work, with friends, with anything that would keep my mind off Daniel. But it was useless. Every time my phone buzzed, I hoped it was him. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face. And then, one evening he called. "Hey," he said when I answered, his voice warm but hesitant. "Are you busy?" "Not really," I replied, my pulse quickening. "Can I come over? There's something I want to talk about." My stomach flipped, and I knew I should say no, but I didn't. "Sure," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "I'll see you soon." When he arrived, I opened the door to find him standing there, his hands in his pockets and a nervous energy radiating off him. "Hey," he said, his smile faint. "Hey," I replied, stepping aside to let him in. We sat on the couch, the silence between us thick with unspoken words. Finally, he broke it. "Claire, I don't know how to say this," he began, his voice low, "but I can't stop thinking about you." The air left my lungs, and for a moment, I thought I might be dreaming. "Daniel, I know it's complicated," he said quickly, "and I know it's probably wrong, but I need you to know how I feel." He stared at him, my heart pounding so loudly, I was sure he could hear it. "This is dangerous," I whispered. "I know," he said, his eyes searching mine, "but it doesn't change how I feel." And just like that, the thread between us tightened, pulling us closer until there was no space left. This wasn't just a shift. It was the beginning of something we couldn't undo. The night Daniel came over was the night everything changed. As soon as those words left his mouth, "I can't stop thinking about you," there was no going back. Something cracked open between us, spilling out emotions I hadn't been brave enough to name. I told myself I could stop this, that I could shut it down. But deep down, I already knew the truth. I didn't want to. After his confession, the air in the room grew heavy, thick with tension. I sat frozen on the couch, every nerve in my body screaming at me to say something, to do something, to stop this before it went any further. But when I looked into his eyes, all I saw was the same longing I'd been fighting to hide. It wasn't just me. He felt it too. "Daniel, we can't," I said, my voice trembling. "You're my uncle. By marriage," he corrected gently, his tone steady but filled with a vulnerability that made my chest ache. "And I know it sounds wrong. I know it is wrong. But you can't tell me you don't feel it too." I opened my mouth to argue, but the words wouldn't come. Because he was right, I did feel it, and the fact that I couldn't admit it aloud made the truth even more unbearable. "We shouldn't," I whispered, dropping my gaze to the floor. "It's too complicated." He reached out, his hand brushing against mine, and the touch sent a shiver up my spine. "I'm not asking for anything, Claire," he said softly. "I just needed you to know. I couldn't keep it to myself anymore." His words hung in the air, fragile but unbreakable, and I felt tears well up in my eyes. I hated how much I wanted this, how much I wanted him, despite everything telling me it was wrong. "I don't know what to do," I admitted, my voice cracking. "I don't know how to feel." He moved closer, his hand still resting lightly on mine. "It's okay," he said. "We don't have to figure it out tonight." But the way he looked at me, the way his hand lingered, said otherwise. And when he leaned in, hesitating just inches from my face, I didn't pull away. I couldn't. This started soft, tentative, like we were testing the waters of something we knew we shouldn't touch. But as soon as his lips pressed against mine, the world fell away. All the fear, all the guilt, all the reasons why this was wrong dissolved into nothing. All that mattered was him, the way he felt, the way his hands cupped my face like I was something precious. I don't know how long it lasted. Seconds, minutes, hours. Time seemed to blur until we finally pulled apart, both of us breathless. His forehead rested against mine, and I could feel his heart pounding as fast as mine. "Claire," he whispered, his voice raw, "tell me to stop. If this isn't what you want, tell me to stop." I couldn't. My lips parted to speak, but the only word that came out was, "Stay." The hours that followed were a haze of quiet conversation and stolen touches. We didn't talk about what this meant or what would happen next. We didn't have to. Every glance, every brush of his hand against mine, every kiss told us what we weren't ready to say out loud. This wasn't just a fleeting moment. It was something bigger, something we couldn't ignore. As the night stretched on, I found myself wrapped in his arms on the couch, his fingers tracing patterns on my back as we lay in comfortable silence. I felt safe, cherished, like I belonged in a way I never had before. But beneath it all was the gnawing fear of what we'd just done. "What happens now?" I asked finally, my voice barely more than a whisper. He sighed, his breath warm against my hair. "I don't know," he admitted. "But I'm not letting this go." "Not unless you want me to?" I didn't answer. I couldn't, because the truth was, I didn't want to let it go either. The days that followed felt like walking a tightrope. Every text from Daniel, every stolen moment when we could talk or see each other, felt both exhilarating and terrifying. We were careful, so careful, but no amount of caution could erase the risk we were taking. I couldn't look my mother in the eye without feeling like a fraud. Every time someone mentioned Daniel, my heart would race, terrified they could somehow see what was happening between us. But even with the guilt, I couldn't stay away. One evening, Daniel called me out of the blue. "Can we meet?" he asked, his voice calm but insistent. "There's something I want to talk to you about." We agreed to meet at his place, an idea that felt dangerous and thrilling all at once. I told myself it was just a conversation, that I could keep things under control. But the moment he opened the door and pulled me into his arms, I knew I was lying to myself. We sat on his couch, the room dimly lit, the atmosphere charged with unspoken tension. He handed me a glass of wine, and for a moment, we just sat in silence, the weight of everything unsaid pressing down on us. "I've been thinking a lot," he said finally, setting his glass down and turning to face me. "About us, about what we're doing." My chest tightened. And I don't regret any of it," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I know it's complicated. I know it's wrong. But I've never felt this way about anyone before." His words hit me like a tidal wave, and I felt my resolve crumbling. "Daniel, it's not just about us," I said, my voice trembling. "What about the family? What about what people will think?" "I don't care what people think," he said, his hand reaching for mine. "All I care about is you. I'm not saying this will be easy, but I'm willing to figure it out if you are." His eyes searched mine, and for a long moment I didn't speak. I couldn't. But then slowly I nodded. "I don't know how we're going to do this," I said quietly. "But I don't want to lose you, not if I have anything to say about it." And in that moment, I believed him. It didn't matter how impossible this was. It didn't matter how wrong it might seem to everyone else. All that mattered was us. We had crossed a line, and there was no going back. But for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid. I was ready. The days after Daniel and I crossed the line felt surreal. Every stolen glance, every whispered word, every touch that lingered too long. It was intoxicating, dangerous, and utterly consuming. The world outside seemed to fade into the background, replaced by a reality where it was just the two of us, navigating a bond that defied reason. But even in our bubble, The weight of what we were doing began to creep in. The walls we'd built around ourselves felt thin, fragile, like they could come crashing down at any moment. And deep down, I knew it was only a matter of time. One evening, my mother called, her voice bright and cheerful. "Claire, we're having a family dinner this weekend. You'll be there, right?" I hesitated, the word "yes" sticking in my throat. A family dinner meant seeing Daniel in a room full of people, pretending nothing had changed between us. The thought was both thrilling and terrifying. "Of course," I said finally, forcing a smile even though she couldn't see me. When Saturday arrived, the house was alive with laughter and the clatter of dishes. My mother was bustling around the kitchen, and my cousins were gathered in the living room, catching up. Everything looked and felt normal, except for the way my heart raced when Daniel walked through the door. He caught my eye almost immediately, his gaze steady but unreadable. He looked calm, composed, like nothing was out of the ordinary. But when our eyes met, there was a flicker of something else. Something only I could see. It sent a shiver down my spine. The dinner itself was a blur. I sat across from Daniel, acutely aware of every move he made. The way his fingers brushed the rim of his glass, the way his eyes lingered on me when he thought no one was looking. It was maddening, knowing we had to keep our distance, knowing we couldn't be alone. At one point I excused myself to the kitchen, needing a moment to breathe. The air in the dining room had felt stifling, like the walls were closing in on me. I leaned against the counter, trying to steady my racing heart, when I heard footsteps behind me. Claire Daniel's voice was low, barely more than a whisper. I turned to find him standing in the doorway, his expression a mixture of concern and something deeper. "You shouldn't be here," I said, my voice trembling. "I couldn't sit there any longer," he admitted, stepping closer. "Not with you so far away." He opened my mouth to respond, but before I could, he reached out, his fingers brushing against mine. The contact was electric, sending a rush of heat through me. I wanted to pull away, to tell him to leave, but I couldn't. I didn't want him to. "Daniel, someone will see," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "They won't," he said, his gaze locking onto mine. I needed to be near you." His words broke something inside me, and for a moment, I forgot about the risks, the consequences, everything. All that mattered was him, standing there, looking at me like I was the only thing in the world that mattered. We managed to make it through the rest of the evening without raising suspicion, but the tension between us was palpable. By the time I got home, my nerves were frayed, and I felt like I was unraveling. I knew this couldn't go on. Not like this, but the thought of ending it, of losing him, was unbearable. The next day, Daniel called. "We need to talk," he said, his voice serious. We met at his place later that evening. The house was quiet, the dim lighting casting long shadows on the walls. He poured us both a glass of wine, and we sat on the couch, the air between us thick with unspoken words. "This isn't sustainable, Claire," he said finally, setting his glass down. "We can't keep sneaking around like this." "No," I said, my voice barely more than a whisper. "But what are we supposed to do? We can't exactly tell everyone." "I don't want to hide," he said, his tone firm. "But I don't want to lose you either. I can't." His words hit me like a tidal wave, and I felt tears welling up in my eyes. "Daniel, I'm scared," I admitted. "I don't know how to do this. We'll figure it out," he said, reaching for my hand. Together. Over the next few weeks, we tried to find a balance. We kept things discreet, careful not to draw attention to ourselves, but every moment we spent together felt like a stolen piece of time. It was exhilarating and terrifying in equal measure. But no matter how careful we were, the cracks began to show. My mother noticed the way I seemed distracted, the way I lit up when Daniel's name was mentioned. She didn't say anything, but her watchful eyes made my stomach twist with guilt. And then there was the night everything came to a head. It was late, and Daniel and I had planned to meet at his place. I arrived to find him pacing the living room, his expression tense. He looked up when I walked in, and I could tell immediately that something was wrong. "What is it?" I asked, my heart pounding. My brother called. He said, running a hand through his hair. He's suspicious, Claire. He said I've been acting different. The words sent a chill down my spine. What did you say? I denied everything, he said quickly. But he's not stupid. He knows something's going on. Panic welled up inside me. What are we going to do? We're going to stay calm, he said, his tone firm. But we need to be more careful. This isn't just about us anymore. I nodded, my mind racing. The walls we'd built around ourselves were crumbling, and I didn't know if we could hold them up. But one thing was clear. We couldn't keep this up forever. Something had to give, and deep down, I knew it would.